Hey everybody, this is Kevin Cofield with Cofield Aviation. Welcome to the YouTube video Operations of Systems Part 2. In Part 1, we looked at, again, the private pilot ACS, Operation of Systems, the PAVE checklist, pilot, airplane environment, external pressures. Operation of Systems falls into that airplane of the PAVE checklist and risk management alongside with airworthiness requirements, performance and limitations as well. But this is the second part of Operation of Systems. Just a real quick brief. The first part is where we basically talked about the power plant in the engine. So we talked about here what makes our engine run. We have a Lycoming 0320 E2D with a Ram STC. Talked about what makes that engine run, right? Fuel, fire, and air, the redundancy built into all of those. I won't get into that. It's all outlined in Part 1. Attached to that engine is an alternator, 14-volt, 60-amp alternator that charges a 12-volt battery. If we lose that alternator, we just unplug the charge. We don't lose all electrical power, just goes down to the battery, and you got about 30 minutes to an hour or so, and you would be, follow the checklist with that, but you'd be, taking off things to preserve the battery. And then what we're going to get in today, what's also attached to that engine is a vacuum pump. And so that's where we're going to kind of get into the six-pack. A lot of the newer aircraft have glass panels, like G1000s and stuff like that. I will briefly explain that, but this is, again, Operational Systems Part 2, and it's focused in on the Cessna 172 Mike model, so 1975. So we talked all about a redundancy here with the air as a carburetor, and you can get carburetor ice there. But again, this all revolves around, look up in your AFM and your POH and go by what that is, because this is Operation of Systems is aircraft specific. So look up your approved flight manual, your POH, look up the type certificate data sheet, and then also look up the ACS, the Private Pilot Airmen Certification Standards. Operation of Systems falls in pre-flight preparation. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to talk about those six flight instruments. So I'm here on the CofieldAviation.com website. We're going to go here to the student section right above my head. We're going to go to downloads, and this is where you can get printable PDF files of everything that I'm talking about. So a lot of my students will print these off and make a little binder. You can print it off on paper or whatever and make notes as you wish, or whatever. So we're going to go here to the Operation of Systems, and we'll just kind of scroll down here as far as what we've already covered. So we've got the power plant. We talked about that in performance and limitations. In Operation of Systems Part 1, what makes the engine run, fuel, fire, and air. The propeller, fixed pitch climb prop, there's our STC for the engine. I will break this down just a little bit at the end of the video. I don't think it's super important that you understand exactly how that piston engine runs. I mean, we're not a mechanic, so I feel like we need to know what we have access to, like when we're talking about fuel, fire, and air, right? So what do you have access to for fuel in the cockpit? So for 172 Mike, that's the fuel selector, that's the mixture control, and that's the primer, all right? What do you have access to fire? That's the ignition switch. You got off, you got left, right, both, where you can isolate magnetos. And then what do you have control of for air in the 172 Mike model? That's your carburetor heat, okay? So that's your redundancy. So that's really all that matters, is when you have anything going wrong with that engine, it's got to be one of the three: fuel, fire, and air. So you go through the items that you have access to, you have control of, and then if that doesn't fix it, then there's nothing else you can do. Then you would go through the other aspects of, if it's just a partial loss of power, if it's full loss of power, gliding the airplane to a safe landing. So I will go over this, basically how the four strokes of an engine, but I'll save that to the end of the video. We talked about the carburetor and the redundancy there in Part 1. We talked about the carburetor icing, then operations of Part 1. operation of systems part 1. We talked about carb icing. We talked about the electrical system. In part 1, we talked about the dual ignition system, and we talked about the magnetos. In part 1, that is the fire right here. But I did want to show here. So we talked about the vacuum pump. So the vacuum pump, if you look, is right here. This is looking at the back of the engine. Basically, if you were looking at the top of the cowl and taking a picture straight down, this is the back of the engine. You got your oil filter right here. These are your magnetos. So there is your, right there is your left mag. Right here is your right mag, and you can see those wires coming out. There are 4 wires coming out, going to 4 spark plugs. There are 4 wires coming out right here, going to the other 4 spark plugs. So again, that's all of operation in part 1, but that's your redundancy. You have 2 spark plugs per cylinder. We have 4 cylinders, so we have a total of 8 spark plugs, which is what's outlined right here. And the vacuum pump, that provides suction for the attitude and the heading gyros, okay, and it is engine driven, so it's the back of the engine there, as you can see. Oil cooler. So just real quick, this is a very, very simple heat exchanger. So basically, if you look right here, this is where the oil will circulate. It's basically like a radiator. It's exactly what it is. It's just a heat exchanger. And so this is airflow, outside airflow. There's a little hole, if you will, in the front of the engine cowling that catches air. It's about about yay big. It's at the behind the cylinders, and that air just simply comes down here, dumps over this hot oil that's circulating, cools it off because the air is cooler than that oil, and then it circulates back into the engine. So super oil cooler system there. And we're going to scroll down. We've already talked about the fuel system in part 1. And then here, so we'll talk about the landing gear and hydraulics. Really simple stuff. We have a fixed tricycle gear. We do not have the conventional gear, would be like a tailwheel aircraft. But here we have the gears down and welded fixed tricycle gear, so it's not retractable or anything. So super simple there. The brakes, that's the only thing hydraulic on the airplane. They're just disc brakes, just kind of like what you would see on your car. Hydraulic fluid used is 5606H. So if you see any sort of red puddling or something underneath the brakes and by the tires, the only thing that would be hydraulic fluid. So you might want to get that checked out. But one of the first things we do when we start taxiing is do a brake check, right? That's right in the ACS when it's talking about taxiing, is to do a brake check. So we always do a brake check right on early in the taxi. Okay, so here is our 6-pack. All right, so this is the old 6-pack. I'll concentrate on the 6-pack, and then really short afterwards I will throw in kind of how that relates to a glass panel for the other students that are flying glass panels. But again, this is what we call the 6-pack. All right, so we've got them labeled here. This is the airspeed indicator. This is the attitude indicator. This is the altimeter. This is your vertical speed indicator. This is the heading indicator, also known as a DG, a directional gyro. And here is our turn coordinator. So different systems supply information to these 6 instruments, and that's what we're going to talk about. So we're going to first start talking about the Pitot-static system. Okay, so it's one of the required inspection items of the 88 if it's for IFR, is every 24 calendar months of Pitot-static inspection. So the Pitot-static instruments are composed of the airspeed indicator, the altimeter, and the vertical speed indicator. Those are your Pitot-static instruments. So what does that really necessarily mean? This is a great little diagram to kind of visually explain and see what's going on. So the Pitot-static system is simply composed of 2 items. So we have a Pitot tube. This is it right here. Depending upon what airplane you fly, in the 172 Mike model, it's on the left wing. Usually there's a cover on it that we keep to keep dirt daubers or bugs or whatever from building in nests and clogging that hole up. But there's a Pitot tube, basically measures ram air pressure coming in here. That sends the information directly to the airspeed indicator. In conjunction with the Pitot tube, we have a static port. So that's why we get the Pitot-static system. The static port is right there, okay, on the far end. That's labeled the static port there, okay? So simply what the static port does, it's a very, very simple system, is it just measures the outside air pressure, okay? And we know from performance and limitations and from operation systems part 1, we talked about engine power and how ours is normally aspirated. When we go up into, we start climbing, go up in the atmosphere, the air gets less and less pressure, right? So that's what the static port does, is it's just reading the differential in pressure. So as we go up in altitude, pressure gets less, and it's read there on the altimeter as an increase in altitude. And then our vertical speed indicator is also getting information from the static port. It's just simply the rate of change. So how fast is that that air pressure changing, and that's read here in the vertical speed indicator. If you will here, see there is an alternate static source in our System 172 mic model. So that would be what we would use if our static port was to become clogged. So if you see here, the Pitot tube only sends information to the airspeed indicator. This is going to be important when we talk about the errors associated with the Pitot-static system. One good way that I use to show these errors that we're going to talk about in just a minute is if you have access to a flight simulator. We have a flight simulator that we use for instrument students, but I do like to I like to use that flight simulator in operation of systems here to simulate these failures that we're about to talk about, so that students can actually see what's happening in those failures. But before we get into that, it's important to understand the Pitot tube only sends information to the airspeed indicator, and the static port sends information to all three. Okay, so anything that affects the static port is going to affect all three. Anything that affects the Pitot tube is only going to affect the airspeed indicator. So we're going to remember that when we start talking about these errors. Okay, right here we do have a Pitot heater switch. This is the only form of de-ice on the airplane. It's just an electrical element. It's like an electric blanket, if you will, that heats this Pitot tube up to prevent icing from forming, or it can act as a de-ice if ice was to build up on this to block this. This will be one of our examples. But if ice builds up to block this ram air inlet here, you can turn that Pitot heat switch on to then de-ice it or melt the ice. So let's just read this really quick. So your Pitot-static system is composed of your airspeed indicator, your vertical speed indicator, and your altimeter. Your Pitot tube provides ram pressure to the airspeed indicator only. It has the Pitot heat as the only form of de-ice on the airplane. The static port provides our pressure to air pressure to the airspeed indicator, VSI, and altimeter. Okay, so let's talk about some errors. It is on the next slide, but I'm just going to point and give you examples. So let's give it from an example of, again, what really matters is we're in the cockpit and we get an indication of X, Y, and Z. Okay, how can we interpret that? We need to have enough operation of systems knowledge so that we can determine what's going on and what instruments to trust and not trust. All right, so we're going to break this down based upon we're flying along and this happens. So we're flying along and we're pitching the nose up, and the vertical speed is showing 0. The altimeter is not climbing or descending. And we know from day one, when we pitch the nose up, then that altimeter should be climbing, right? Vertical speed is going to show you the rate of climb in feet per minute. So normally it's going to be, 500-600 feet per minute. It's probably going to be normal for a 172. And then we push the nose down, and we should get a decrease, 500-600 feet per minute descent rate. Altimeter should be dropping down. But let's just say we're doing this. Vertical speed shows 0, altimeter is frozen. It's not moving up or down, okay? Airspeed, though, it seems to be working fine. We pitched the nose up, airspeed's decreasing. Well, that's normal, right? We pitched the nose down, airspeed's increasing. Again, that's going to be a normal indication. The only abnormal indication to you is vertical speed 0, and it's like, oh, I'm holding altitude perfect, when you know good and well you're not, okay? So what has happened, all right? This is the operation systems knowledge that we need to understand in the cockpit when we get those indications to go, here's the problem. What the problem is your static port has become blocked, okay? So when you block the static port, you trap pressure in this line right here, and that line is sent to all three instruments, okay? So when you trap pressure in here, it's not indicating a change. The altimeter is not indicating a change in pressure. Your vertical speed is not indicating a change in pressure. So it's just saying, hey, you're at the same altitude, right? Even though you know you're going up and down. All right, so we need to remedy that. We need to get pressure back into these lines to fix it. How can we do that? We have an alternate static port, an alternate static source in the 172 mic. So we can just simply pull this alternate static. You check it on pre-flight before you start the engine every single time. And once you pull that, then boom, we get an alternate source of air pressure into here, and then everything's going to work as normal. Now, if you're in an airplane that does not have alternate static, some of the older airplanes do not. If you're in an airplane that doesn't have alternate static, the only way we can get air pressure into here would be to break one of these instruments. And the one that doesn't matter as much, or matters the least, would be your vertical speed indicator. So you could actually break the glass of this vertical speed indicator to get pressure into the system here. So we're talking about a static port failure. If you recognize that the altimeter is frozen, the vertical speed is showing 0 as you're climbing and descending, airspeed seems to be working correctly. I'll explain what's happening. The airspeed is giving you an indication, however, it is not going to be accurate because it requires both the ram air pressure, which is not affected in this scenario. It's only in the static port that's blocked. So it's getting normal ram air pressure, which is the reason why you're getting airspeed fluctuations that would appear normal to you, but it needs that static source to calibrate it for the given altitude, okay? So again, to remedy it, you can pull an alternate static. As soon as you do that, boom, everything's back to normal. Or if you don't have an alternate static, you can break the glass here. But let's explain what's happening to the airspeed indicator. So if the static port becomes blocked, again, altimeter is frozen, vertical speed is showing 0, there's no change. That's going to be an easy way to see that in the airplane, that I'm climbing and descending and the altimeter is frozen. But again, the airspeed indicator is going to be showing something. However, it's not going to be accurate, okay? So let's just say that blockage blocked at 3,000 feet. We're going to know exactly what altitude that static port became blocked, because your altimeter is not going to move off that altitude, all right? So let's just say the static port became blocked at 3,000 feet. All right, when we climb above that altitude, okay, your airspeed is going to actually read slightly lower than actual airspeed. So if we look right here, the static port becomes blocked here, your altimeter and VSI freezes, airspeed indicator will read inaccurate. As airplane climbs above the blockage altitude, the airspeed indication reads inaccurately low. As the airspeed descends below that blockage, so think about if it's at 3,000 feet, when we descend below that altitude, that blockage, your airspeed is going to read actually inaccurately high, okay? So that's how your airspeed indicator is going to be off. Now, in the altitudes that we're flying on 172, you're not going to notice it. It may be about 1 knot per 1,000 feet, okay? So you're going to be no more than plus or minus 10 knots, because you're not going to be flying any higher than 10,000 feet. So for practicality standpoint on 172, your airspeed indicator is going to be pretty well accurate to the most part. But you do need to understand that it will not be accurate. In this scenario, with the static port blocked, when you climb above the altitude where it was blocked, your airspeed will actually read inaccurately low. So it will read lower than what your actual speed is now. When you go below the altitude where the static port became blocked, your airspeed will read inaccurately high. So it will be showing an airspeed that's higher than your actual true airspeed, which can be a problem, right? When we're lower in altitude and we're going to land, then your airspeed might be showing, 80 knots or 80 miles per hour, depending upon if you're in a mile per hour airplane or not. But your actual airspeed may be 70. All right. That's where in this situation, if you couldn't remedy it by an alternate static or breaking the glass, once you do that, everything's accurate again. Okay. Except for if you broke the glass and vertical speed indicator, it's not, right? But once you pull that alternate static, then everything's working as normal. Okay. But if you did not remedy that, and the way you would know you didn't remedy it is because your VSI is frozen, your altimeter is frozen, right? Then your airspeed will read inaccurately low. So you might want to use other available resources, which would be like your GPS or your GPS speed. That might be what I would be using for landing. Let's talk about the other error, okay? So the other error would be if your Pitot tube became blocked. And there are two errors that we can associate with the Pitot tube. But let's be really, really clear looking at this diagram. If anything is happening with your Pitot tube, the only instrument affected is your airspeed indicator. That's it, because the Pitot tube only sends information to the airspeed indicator. If it's anything with the static port, all three are affected, as you can see. But if it's something with the Pitot tube, it's only the airspeed indicator itself. So let's talk about, we're in the airplane flying along, and then all of a sudden the airspeed goes to 0. Okay? What has happened? Again, we just need to know enough knowledge as pilots to understand what has happened and can we fix it. Okay, so in this scenario, we're flying along, we're climbing, the altimeter is showing a climb, vertical speed is showing a climb, and then airspeed goes to 0. We push the nose down, airspeed still at 0, but vertical speed showing a descent, altimeter showing a descent. Those are working correctly. But airspeed showing 0, just like it is right here. And you're flying along and you know that's not the case. You're not stalled, right? And the ground speed showing 100 knots, all right? So what has happened? What has happened is your ram air inlet has become blocked. So no longer are you getting air, that ram air pressure, into this tube right here, okay? So whether, you left the Pitot tube cover on at takeoff, or a bug hits this, or ice builds up here and it blocks it, okay? There is a little drain hole right here. If this drain hole is open, and it should always be, we're checking this drain hole in the pre-flight to make sure that it is clear. The purpose of this drain hole is simply to drain out precipitation, okay? So when it rains or whatever, or moisture causes condensation in these static lines here, this moisture is allowed to drain out. That's the only purpose of that drain opening. So if that drain opening is clear, which it should be, if it's clear and we get a blockage here of the ram air, not allowing air pressure, airspeed inside of that tube, then what's going to happen, whether this is with ice or again a bug or something, what's going to happen is that air pressure is going to drain out of that drain hole, all right? And then that will indicate 0 airspeed. So all of this pressure goes out the drain hole, airspeed shows 0, okay? The only way you can remedy this is if this was ice built up here, you could turn the Pitot heat on, it would melt the ice, you get ram air pressure back into that, and then voila, your airspeed indicator is going to work again, and everything's going to be just fine. All right. Otherwise, if it's a bug or you left the Pitot tube cover on, there's no fixing that. All right. Just fly the airplane by feel, or better yet, use all available resources. Fly the airplane by GPS. Okay. just use the GPS airspeed there. Yeah, if you're flying into a 10-knot headwind, you're going to be 10 knots faster than that speed. You're not going to know, how much headwind you have, but just fly it based upon your ground speed. You're going to be just fine. It won't be a problem. Get the airplane on the ground. And by all means, though, if you get any stall warning indications, adhere to that. Trust that for sure. So here's the second problem. Let's just say you're flying along, you pitch the nose up, and your vertical speed is showing a climb, your altimeter is showing a climb, so that's all normal, but your airspeed shows zero. I mean, not zero, but your airspeed stays the same. Let's just say you're at 100 miles per hour or 100 knots, whatever your airspeed indications are. And you pitch the nose up, what should happen to that airspeed? That airspeed should start to slow, right? But we pitch that nose up, and the airspeed stays at 100. Doesn't change. We pitch the nose down, we're getting proper indications here, vertical speed showing a descent, altimeter showing a descent, but the airspeed stays exactly the same. It's not changing at all. We know we got a problem, right? And if it's with the airspeed indicator, the only problem we have is with the Pitot tube. Static port is working just fine. So here's what has happened. So what has happened is we've had a blockage of not only the Pitot tube right here, but we also had a blockage of the drain hole, meaning that it is trapping pressure inside of this line, okay? So it's not showing any change in pressure or any change in that airspeed as we climb or as we descend, okay? So how can we fix that? If it's simply ice that's built up, then we can again turn the Pitot heat on, and that would melt the ice. And then even though the drain hole is clogged, it's not a big deal. Again, the purpose of that drain hole is only to drain water out. If we get rid of this clog, then the airspeed is going to act as normal again, okay? As that airspeed changes, the ram air pressure changes, and airspeed will act normal again, okay? But if you keep this block here, then the airspeed is going to stay the same. It will be inaccurate, of course, because you're climbing, you're descending, the airspeed is not changing. It will slightly change with altitude. And here's how that happens. So let's just say it gets blocked at 5,000 feet, okay? If you climb above that 5,000 foot altitude, again, your vertical speed showing a climb, altimeter is showing a climb as you climb on up, airspeed is showing the exact same. However, it will start to increase slightly as you increase with altitude. So it kind of acts like an altimeter. You might learn that in your written test stuff. But your airspeed indicator will start to act like an altimeter, meaning it shows an airspeed higher than your actual, okay? And then if you descend below that 5,000 feet, your airspeed is going to start to drop just a little bit. But again, it's going to basically stay the same. So you have an issue. So it really doesn't matter if it's climbing a little bit or descending a little bit. And it's the same way when we talked about the static port, we talked about it's about a knot per 1,000 feet. So you're not going to notice a big change. If you're at 5,000 feet and you descend down to 2,000 feet, your airspeed would drop maybe 3 knots or something. But you are going to know that you have an issue there because the airspeed is going to basically stay the same, except for it will slightly increase as you go up in altitude. It will slightly decrease as you go below the altitude. Okay, so let's just read. Now that I've explained that to you, let's go here. We're just going to read it out, all right? So if the Pitot ram air inlet is blocked and the drain hole remains open, the only thing affected is the airspeed indicator. The airspeed will read 0 because the air pressure releases through the drain hole. It's going to be super easy to find out, right? And then turn your Pitot heat on, and if it's ice, then it'll melt, and then you'll get airspeed indications back. The other would be your Pitot ram air inlet is blocked. The drain hole is also blocked. Again, the only thing that is affected is the airspeed indicator. The airspeed indicator will act like an altimeter, so pressure is trapped in those lines. As the airplane climbs above the blockage altitude, the airspeed indication will slightly increase. as the airplane descends below the blockage altitude, airspeed indication will slightly decrease. The biggest thing you're going to notice right here, though, is as we pitch the nose up, airspeed stays the same. Pitch the nose down, airspeed stays the same. You know that's not right then. So that means your ram air inlet's blocked and your drain hole's blocked. Last, we talked about the first indication. Static port is blocked. That affects all three. Affects the airspeed indicator, vertical speed indicator, and the altimeter. The altimeter and the VSI freezes, so it shows no change. Airspeed indicator will read inaccurate, and we talked about that. As you go above, the altitude is actually going to read inaccurately low. As you descend below altitude where that static port became blocked, it's going to read inaccurately high. Okay, so those are your Pitot-static errors. Okay, so we're going to go back here to the 6-pack. So now that you have a firm understanding of the airspeed indicator, altimeter, and vertical speed. So again, the static port, what does it send information to? It sends information to the airspeed indicator, altimeter, and vertical speed. The P.2, where does it send information to? Only the airspeed indicator. Okay, and we talked about the errors, right, of all of those. Now that leaves 3 more. Okay, these 3 other instruments are what we call gyroscopic instruments. So gyroscopic instruments provide rigidity in space. So basically the way that these operate is these gyros spin about 25,000 RPM. So they spin really, really fast. So think about people that can spin a basketball on their finger or a pop top or something. If you're spinning a basketball at 25,000 RPMs on your finger, it's going to resist. It's going to tend to kind of stay there, right? And it's going to resist the motion of you trying to act against it. All right, it's going to provide rigidity in space. It's going to stay there. That's exactly what these do right here. Okay, so it's providing rigidity in the space, and the airplane will move around it. Okay, so that's about all you need to know about how these gyroscopic instruments work. But we just spin them. We spin the gyros 2 different ways. Okay, so why would we do anything 2 different ways in an airplane? It's called redundancy, right? So we spin these gyros again in 2 different ways. So let's talk about how we do that. So here we go. The attitude indicator and the heading indicator, also known as the directional gyro, they are spun by the vacuum pump. And remember, we looked at the vacuum pump on the back of the engine. Ta-da! Looks like I skipped over. There we go. There's the vacuum pump on the back of the engine. So if your engine was to quit, then you are going to lose this instrument and this instrument. You got bigger problems, right? Other, than just losing those 2. But we have a suction gauge in the airplane, and that's what you're checking on the pre-flight to make sure that suction is provided to these 2. So simply, we're spinning these by air. Okay, so I kind of liken it to you're at when you're a kid, you're at a doctor's office, and they have that little fan, that you have to blow, and you spin it because they're checking your lungs or whatever. That's exactly what's happening here. We're creating suction from that engine and throwing air by those gyros to make them spin. Very simple, okay? So as long as you have suction pressure via the suction gauge, then you've got air flowing by these gyros that's spinning at about 25,000 RPMs, provides rigidity in space, right? So that's these 2 instruments here. Now, your heading indicator, your directional gyro in the 172, it's not slave, so it does have precession. So about every 15 minutes, you have to reset it with a magnetic compass, okay? So it does precess some, but again, your vacuum pump, go back to this. I think this gives a good representation. Your vacuum pump spins those 2 gyros. Now, this is also a gyro, works the exact same way as far as something spins it. However, the battery is what spins that gyro. So it is electrically spun. So that way, if you were to lose your vacuum pump, then your battery is still spinning this. So you would still have bank information. You just would not have attitude indicator. You would not have a heading indicator. Now, this airplane is certified for 4 kinds of operations. We talked about this in pilot qualifications, airworthiness requirements. It's certified for day VFR, night VFR, day IFR, and night IFR. So these instruments are what you would need in IFR conditions, okay? Or even night VFR. But if you're daytime VFR, it really doesn't matter if you lose these instruments, right? Because your attitude indicator, you need to be looking 80% outside anyways in VFR flying. So all your students, don't focus inside the airplane. 20% should be inside, 80% should be outside. So who cares, right? Look outside. You've got a beautiful horizon to see outside, right? Heading indicator, yeah, that's nice to have, but if it was to go away, we can use the magnetic compass. We're going to talk about the magnetic compass errors in just a minute, but really, you're going to use track on the GPS. I mean, let's be real here. You're not going to be really utilizing that magnetic compass with all its errors in there. Just fly the track on the GPS. Yes, that is not a magnetic heading. That is compensated for wind drift. But I would be exercising emergency PSC authority in that. But anyways, we will technically be using the magnetic compass in training. You're going to learn how to use the magnetic compass. We're going to simulate these vacuum failures, especially for instrument students, and then make you fly by reference to the magnetic compass that we'll talk about. But pretty simple. Again, these 3 are all gyroscopic. We just spin them in 2 different ways so that if we lost a vacuum pump, we don't lose the turn coordinator. Because think about it, if you're in the clouds, well, now you don't have this for a bank, but now you have this for bank, and you can use the altimeter for pitch and so forth and so forth. If you lose your battery, okay, well, now you've lost this bank information, but you still have this for pitch and bank. So that's why we spin those with 2 different ways, is for redundancy. So real quick, gyroscopic instruments, attitude indicator and heading indicator. Gyros are spun by the vacuum pump / air. Turn coordinator, gyro is spun by electrical system or the battery. It's the indicated rate of turn with a side slip indicator, step on the ball, right? So you can usually hear this when you turn the master switch on. You'll hear a little whine up. That's it starting to spin that gyro. Okay. Let's see here. So here's the compass errors that we just talked about. So if we lost that vacuum pump, we lost the heading indicator, now we're having to use the compass. In the northern hemisphere, it has these errors, okay? So acronyms galore. UNOS is the way to remember our turning errors. So undershoot north, overshoot south. So this means that the compass indicates a turn slower than you're actually turning. When you're turning to a north heading, it indicates a turn faster than you're turning to a southerly heading. So simply do UNOS, undershoot north, overshoot south. So if you're turning from east or west heading to north heading 360, you're going to undershoot it. So you're going to level off about 20 degrees prior. So if you're on a 090 heading, turning to a 360 heading, you're going to stop at about a 020 heading, go wings level, and then it will swing back to about 360 because it's indicating a turn slower than you're actually turning. Opposite when you're going south, you're going to overshoot south. So if we're turning from east heading to a southern heading, then we're going to overshoot south. So we're going to go past 180 to about a 200 heading, about 20 degrees past it, go wings level, and then it's going to swing back to the south there. So undershoot north, overshoot south for turning errors. You have no turning errors when you're turning east or west. So if you're turning from the north or the south to an east or a west heading, you can roll right out on east or west, and you will have no errors there. ANS is your acceleration errors. So this is only going to be on east and west headings. So if you accelerate on an east or west heading, it's going to indicate a turn to the north. All right. If you are decelerating on an east or west heading, it's going to slightly indicate a turn to the south. It'll kind of dip a little bit to the south. If you're accelerating or decelerating to the north or south, you get no errors. Okay, so your turning errors are north and south, your acceleration errors are east and west there. Okay, so this is kind of your compass errors. Unos, undershoot north, overshoot south, and ands, accelerate north, decelerate south. It's a great way to remember that. All right, avionics. So we have a Garmin 340 audio panel. This has been updated to the new Bluetooth version. We have a GNX 375 GPS transponder and ADS-B out and in. The manual of this is on the website, but awesome, awesome, awesome. You see this app right here. Please download this Garmin GPS Trainer app on an iPad. It's iPad only, but it allows you to actually play around with this Garmin G375, all right? And if you're flying an airplane that's got a 650 or 750, you can also do that Garmin GPS Trainer app and just pick which one you have. So for our students, when you download that Garmin GPS Trainer app, select that you have the GNX 375, and then you can sit there just like if you were sitting down in the airplane, punch and play and build flight plans, and it's a really great way to operate the equipment. Remember, flight deck management is being able to operate all of this stuff. So it gives you a good way to operate that. This here is a Bendix King KX155 comm and nav. So this is our nav, this is our comm 1 right here. We have a use frequency and a standby frequency. We change the frequency right here. This is our nav 1. So this is where we would be selecting VOR frequency. We have the active frequency here and a standby here. So when we're changing frequencies, we're changing the standby. So this is nav only. You're going to be focusing in on this after your solo. This is COM 1, which is here. This is your COM 2. So this entire radio right here is just a COM. And this is your COM 2. That's right here on the avionics panel. This is a autopilot that is actually in-op. So we actually have an in-op sticker on that. But real quick on this audio panel, let me kind of zoom in on that real quick. Now, really, this is going to be a whole lot easier once you actually just start flying the airplane. But if you see here, you have COM 1 mic, and then there's a COM 1 right up here. The best way to remember this is if you want to talk on it, okay? So if you want to talk, you're going to hit mic. So if you've got your frequency set in here, this is where you are changing the frequency, and you would be the standby. You push this button right here, it'll switch it over to the use. Then if you want to talk on this frequency, you're going to hit the mic button. And when you hit that mic button, it'll go green right here, and it'll also make you listen. So think about this button up here. This little small button is your headset. So if we want to hear up here at top of our head, if we want to hear the headset, we're going to push this button. Well, guess what? If we talk on it, it'll force us to listen. So if we push the mic, it'll also change the headset to listen to. So we've got to be able to listen to the frequency that we're talking on, okay? Now, same thing for this. However, this is COM 2, right? So this is where we're changing that COM 2 frequency. This is where we're transferring it. So that button is the same as that button, and this knob is the same as that knob. And here's where our standby frequency would be. This would be where our active frequency is. And if we wanted to talk on COM 2, if you notice, this is the newer radio, okay? It's the GTR 225 that you can see right here, the Garmin GTR 225 COM. This is our newer frequency. This is what we're usually always talking on. So if we want to talk on this, we would hit the COM 2 mic, right? Because mic is what we want to talk on. It'll automatically select COM 2 listen. And then if we wanted to be talking on COM 1, but we also want to listen, if we want to be talking on COM 2 right here, but we also want to be listening to COM 1, we can do both. So we can hit COM 1 mic. It will make us listen to COM 2 mic. Goodness. It'll make us listen to COM 2. And then if we want to also listen to COM 1, then we can just simply push the COM 1 up here in the headset. So think about this up here is listen. So this is your headset. mic is to talk. All right. We don't have a COM 3, so don't even worry about that. COM 1 and 2 button, what that does is that will split. The left seat pilot will be talking on COM 1. Goodness, I can't point. The left seat pilot will be talking on COM 1. The right seat pilot, the co-pilot, will be talking on COM 2. So it just splits it. This is a speaker button. So everything that you're hearing, listening wise, here will be going over the cockpit speaker. PA makes you act like an airline pilot. So PA, when you hit the mic button, it won't be transmitting on any of the radios. It'll be transmitting over that speaker. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, blah, 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 right? This is the greatest button on here. This is the pilot isolate button. This is your sterile cockpit button. So if you push this pilot isolate button, what it will do is it'll isolate you as the pilot, you on its own intercom system with the radios, and then the passengers can sit there and talk and whatever, and they're not disturbed by the radio, and you can't hear them either. So it's a great sterile cockpit selection. Also, this is your individual volume. So the outer knob is your volume for your personal headset, and then this is the squelch. So if it's hard to talk, you can move that squelch to the left, and it'll make it a little easier to talk. This is the personal volume on COM 1. This is the personal volume on COM 2. Or I say personal, that's everybody's volume. So if you turn this up, you're turning everybody's volume up on COM 1, turning everybody's volume up on COM 2. And if you turn the volume up here, you are just personally only turning your volume up. And then this is the volume control for the co-pilot. Same exact thing. And then if you see here, the crew button will then isolate the two passengers in the back so they can talk. And then the two crew up front, the pilot and the co-pilot, can sit there and talk with each other, and also can hear the radios and whatever. So sterile cockpit, this is when I'm flying my kids, I push that pilot button. So when they're screaming and yelling and talking or whatever, I can't hear anything that they're saying. I'm focused in the critical phases of flight, air traffic control, runway incursion avoidance, reading back stuff. Super, super important, okay? This nav 1 will allow you to listen to this nav frequency. So then there's the volume for the nav. So when we tune and identify VOR frequencies, you'll be doing that in your cross-country training. This nav 1 button is where we're going to listen to that. We don't have a nav 2. We don't have a DME. We don't have an ADF, so those buttons are never used. Okay, that's a really quick rundown of how you would use your avionics. Again, this is flight deck management, and it's more of you're going to be learning that in the airplane itself. But of course, this is very aircraft specific, right? Your airplane may have different stuff in it. But please do download that Garmin GPS Trainer app. Really good stuff. GTR 225, COM only, KX 155, COM here, nav here, ground-based navigation, VOR. Here's our satellite-based navigation in our GPS. As our GNX 375, and then Garmin 340 audio panel. Again, we haven't updated one of this. I haven't updated the picture, but essentially runs the same, except we have the ability to Bluetooth or music and stuff like that to that. All right, let's talk about flight controls here really quick. Your primary flight controls are the controls that move the three axes. Okay, so we have the longitudinal axis that runs down, if you can see here, from the prop to the tail. All right, so ailerons control movement along the longitudinal axis of the bank. We have a lateral axis that goes from wingtip to wingtip. So your elevator controls movement along that lateral axis. And then we have a vertical axis. My goodness, we have a vertical axis that the yaw controls. Okay, so your primary flight controls the movement along your three axes. So ailerons control movement along your longitudinal axis. The bank elevator controls movement along the lateral axis, which is your pitch, and then your rudder controls movement along your vertical axis, all right? And they are controlled by simple cables and pulleys. So when you're pulling up and down, then that's all simple cable and pulleys. Secondary flight controls, flaps, all right? So flaps allow us to make a steeper angle of a descent without gaining airspeed. So flaps add lift, and conversely, they also add drag. And so again, it just allows us to make a steeper angle of a descent without gaining airspeed. Now that we have flaps, we don't have to do forward slips, okay? Elevator trim is probably the most important secondary flight control on the airplane, and that it just allows us to have fingertip flying, a very light golf grip, if you will, on the yoke. One thing you're going to hear over and over and over and over and over, especially in the very beginning of flying, the basics of straight and level flight, turns, climbs, descents, is pitch, power, trim. Pitch, power, trim, pitch, power, trim. You're going to hear, if you've got a good instructor, you're going to hear that over and over and over. So pitch, power, trim. Pitch, power, trim in that order, okay? You're starting to climb, you pitch the nose up, add power, trim the nose up so that you can basically let go of the yoke. For the most part, just a really light grip and it stays there. You level off, you pitch the nose down, you reduce power, you trim the nose down to where it'll keep the pitch with the elevator. So again, pitch, power, trim, pitch, power, trim, pitch, power, trim. Go to sleep thinking pitch, power, trim, all right? So that's your flight controls. And then the last thing here, and we're done. There is no oxygen system on the airplane, but I want to show you the rules. So oxygen rules from 12,500 feet MSL to 14,000 feet above sea level, the crew member must use supplemental oxygen if there for greater than 30 minutes. From 14,000 feet to 15,000 feet, the crew must use supplemental oxygen for the entire length that you're there. And then above 15,000 feet, the crew still has to use the oxygen, but passengers must be supplied oxygen above 15,000 feet. Passengers don't have to use oxygen. They just have to have access to oxygen, okay? I think it was John and Martha King, funny way that they did to remember this was they would say you can just whisper to your mother-in-law that there's oxygen up here. You know, so just you just have to let them know. You don't have to make them do oxygen. But you as the crew, 12.5 to 14, if you're there for more than 30 minutes, you have to be using oxygen. Above 14, the crew has to be using oxygen all the time. Above 15, you've got to allow access to the passengers. All right, so that pretty much finishes up operations of systems. All right, just going to go through here, make sure I hadn't forgotten anything. We talked about the oil cooler, magnetos, vacuum pump, dual ignition system, electrical. Yeah, that's basically it. I did promise you at the end of this I would go over this, but I want to first, though, just go over the ACS and show you this is what the ACS says the objective is. So the objective here is determine that the applicant, this is for your oral exam, this is for your flight test, this is the private pilot ACS. Determine that the applicant exhibits satisfactory knowledge, risk management, and skills associated with the safe operation of systems on the airplane provided for the flight test. So the applicant demonstrates an understanding of airplane systems to include these. So the evaluator must at least evaluate 3 of these, but we talked about all of them, right? So we talked about primary flight controls, secondary flight controls, power plant, propeller, landing gear, fuel, oil, and hydraulics, electrical, avionics, Pitot-static, vacuum pressure, and associated flight instruments. Environmental, so that was, we talked about heat and air. It's a simple system on the 172. It's just literally 2 knobs inside the airplane. We pull that heat. We talked about where that heat came from in operations of systems part 1. It's just heated air from the exhaust shroud. Be careful with that, though. If there's a crack in the exhaust, you could be pumping carbon monoxide. So if you're using that heat in the environmental system and you get any headache or dizziness or lightheadedness or whatever, stop using that, turn off that heat and ventilate the cabin. There's another little knob that allows air. There's no air conditioner 172. Super, super simple environmental control, literally just two little knobs there. De-icing and anti-icing, the only de-ice equipment we have is the Pitot heat. We don't have water rudders because that's airplane single engine C and airplane multi-engine C. It's not applied to us. Oxygen system, we don't have oxygen system, but we talked about that. Indications, procedures for managing system abnormalities or failures. We talked about that, and then like if we had an alternator failure or whatever. So the risk management, the applicant demonstrates the ability to identify, assess, and mitigate risk encompassing failure to detect system malfunctions or failures. Again, that's where I was like, hey, we don't have to be rocket scientists here. We just got to know, how do we know that there's an alternator failure? So you get the negative amperage, the low voltage light. You know, how do you know X, Y, and Z, right? That's our systems knowledge. We've got to know what's happening, and then what have I lost, and then how can I fix it? Improper management of a system failure to monitor and manage automated systems. That'd be like an autopilot that we don't have. Then he's got to see that you operate at least 3 of those systems and use appropriate checklists. Use checklists properly. This is huge, 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 huge. I have memory items on the Cofield Aviation website. I think those memory items are super important to be able to do. There's only 5 of them for you to be able to do basically engine fire scenarios, engine failures. You should be able to do that without referencing a checklist. Now, if you get time afterwards, sure, reference a checklist. Everything else is not memory. Use a checklist. You have an alternator failure, don't do anything by memory. It's not one of those 5 memory items. Use a checklist. Use a checklist. Use a checklist. If it's not those 5 memory items, again, that is on the Cofield Aviation website in downloads. I'll show you really quick. Right there. There's the memory items, okay? Also, here's our systems limitations for our aircraft, specific there. Okay, really quick. If you don't care about this, thank you for watching. This will only take just a second. But we're going to talk about basically how this 4-stroke engine creates the power. Okay, so here's our cylinder. Okay, we have 4 of them. 1, 2, and they're on the other side, 3, 4. Okay, so basically in this, it starts with an intake. So here are our rods. Okay, that's connected to our camshaft. That's what's moving those rods. And then the piston is actually moving the crankshaft. So if you'll see right above the little Venmo thing is where it's pointing to the crankshaft. So right here, and that's what's actually turning the prop. Okay, but really simple. All right. So what happens is our piston moves this direction inside the cylinder. The rod opens up our intake valve, and so it draws our fuel-air ratio. You remember where we make that is in our carburetor. All right. So in our carburetor with the mixture, we control the fuel-air ratio. Okay. So that gets sucked in through this intake valve. All right. And then from there, the next one is the compression stroke. So then it compresses all that air, compresses it in, and then we light this bad boy off. Okay, so the mag and the timing will ignite this spark plug on the top and the spark plug on the bottom. It creates an explosion. The energy of that explosion pushes the piston back here to the engine. That's our power stroke. So that's what actually turns the crankshaft, that turns the prop, that makes us go forward in the thrust. And then it will come back, and then this exhaust valve opens and it pushes all that burned exhaust out this exhaust valve into the exhaust. That's where our exhaust gas temperature gauges are. And so that's, about 1400 degrees or so that's getting pushed out. And then it happens all over again. All right. So fairly simple how that works. This is the air intake. I talked about going to the oil cooler. And again, there's your cylinders, 1, 2, 3, 4, our crankshaft. Our camshaft is what's operating these exhaust valves and intake valves and all that good fun stuff. And take your time, you can read all of that, basically how I explain that. This is looking at the bottom of the engine. So here is the bottom spark plug of that cylinder. There's that intake at the back that we were just looking at. That goes down here to the oil cooler. Here is your carburetor right there. There's your intake manifold. So again, you're creating the fuel-air ratio here, and then there's your intake. So that's where it gets sucked into. It does the compression, it fires the spark plugs, it does the power stroke, and then it opens this exhaust valve right here and pushes this hot exhaust. You see how that's kind of burned? It pushes this hot exhaust out. Here's exhaust shroud, so we're dumping air inside of that shroud over that 1400 degree that 1400 degree pipe that warms it up, and then we use that warm, nice hot air for carburetor heat and also heat to the cabin. Okay, so that's the same hot air. That's just the hot air that's going over these, or the air that's going over these pipes. That's 1400 degrees that gets heated up. We're using that there. Remember, this is our redundancy. So there is this is the air of the fuel, fire, and air. There is our filter right here in the front. This is our air box. So if this was to become clogged, okay, the flap in here is sitting like this with the carb heat off. You pull carburetor heat, the flap goes like this. It shuts off air here, and then we're using this heated air that goes up into the carburetor. So not only does that prevent carburetor icing, it's also a backup heat source. I mean, a redundancy, a backup air source for the engine. Okay, so fairly simple, right? Fairly simple. And again, I'm just going to go through this, make sure I hadn't forgotten anything. Now, we have talked about it all. So wow, like 2 hours worth, right? I know that's a lot between part 1 and part 2, but I promise you, it's worth it. Just all you need to know is what's in these 2 videos. Print out the slides and just watch it over and over until you get it. If you know all this information, you're going to do just fine on your oral exam. So thank you for taking the time. Watch these videos. Please like, comment, subscribe. If you've got any sort of questions or whatever, feel free to ask. If you've got recommendations for videos, please feel free to ask. I try to do a live video every couple of weeks, so depending upon when you're watching this, go to the archives, or maybe catch a YouTube live and comment and ask me questions in the live. So again, Operation Systems Part 2, thank you very much.